In this lecture, we will look at the foundation and expansion of the Aztec Empire, and we will build upon the reading by Ross Hassig to explore the strategies that were used to create the empire, and Hassig differentiates between hegemonic strategies and territorial strategies. We will see how warfare was very important in the creation and maintenance of the Aztec Empire. And following our discussion of the Aztec, we will compare the Aztec to the Inca Empire and look at some important differences between them. But first, what is an empire? Empires are expansionist states, ones that have extended their control by absorbing or subjugating other neighboring states. While most early states were relatively homogeneous in terms of their ethnic makeup, largely composed of individuals sharing the same ethnic and cultural background, empires are much more heterogeneous, incorporating multiple ethnic groups, people from different linguistic and cultural backgrounds. The primary goal of empires is to control and extract wealth and resources from territories that have been subjugated to their political and economic will. Empires extend their domains across different environmental zones, providing access to a wider range of resources, and in many cases providing access to resources that are not available in the home territory of the empire. Empires use state religion and/or military might in order to incorporate and dominate their subjects. While modern archaeologists and historians refer to them as the Aztec, they referred to themselves as the Mexica. The term Aztec was coined by the 19th century historian Walter Prescott Webb and was derived from the Mexicas' name for their homeland, Aztlan. The Mexica saw themselves as one of the Chichimex tribes, foragers of the northern mountains and deserts in northern Mexico, north of the Valley of Mexico, where the Aztec Empire would emerge. The Chichimex were created within a sacred cave in a sacred mountain, and as they emerged, the different tribes went on different migrations to different locations, directed by prophecy and the gods. The migrations of the Mexica led them south into the Valley of Mexico around AD 1200, and they arrived into a politically competitive environment. In the Valley of Mexico, there were many independent city-states that competed against each other, and they allied themselves to the Culhua, who lived in the southern end of the Valley of Mexico, and claimed their right to rule because of the descent of the royal families of the Culhua from the rulers of the earlier center of Tula. Tula was the successor to Teotihuacan. After Teotihuacan fell in the 700s, Tula emerged in the AD 1000s and ruled until about the mid-1100s before it collapsed, leading to this fragmented and competitive political environment that the Aztec entered into. The Valley of Mexico in the Central Plateau is centered on a large lake, Lake Texcoco, and the eastern side of the basin, on the east side of the lake, were people of the Ocolhua ethnic group. At the southern side of the basin were people of the Culhua ethnic group, and on the west side of the basin were people of the Tepanec ethnic group. There were different city-states along the shores of the lake, and in different areas these city-states were comprised of different ethnic groups, and they competed against each other to try to expand their territory and their tributary domains. And the Mexica entered into this competitive political environment and allied themselves to the Culhua living in the southern end of the basin. The Mexica served the Culhua king as mercenaries in his wars against his competitors. To seal this alliance, a daughter of the Culhua king was given as a wife to the leader of the Mexica in 1325. But the Mexica seem to have misunderstood the offer of the wife. And this is from the Mexica's own historical accounts. They claimed that she was given to them and that she must be married to their god, Huitzilopochtli, great hummingbird on the left who is associated with war and the sun. and this Culhua princess was sacrificed to the god. She was flayed, her skin was removed in one piece, and then worn by a Mexica priest. Now when the Culhua king arrived at what he thought was going to be a feast celebrating this wedding, he was shocked and horrified to find that his daughter had been sacrificed. He ordered his men to drive the Mexica out of his territory. Prophecy led the fleeing Mexica to a barren island in the middle of Lake Texcoco. There they found a golden eagle, sitting on top of a prickly pear cactus, eating a serpent, fulfilling the prophecy that was given upon their emergence, marking the location of their new home. This iconography of a golden eagle eating a serpent seated upon a prickly pear cactus continues to be a powerful symbol in the modern state of Mexico, and is found on the Mexican flag and on Mexican money. So here we see a golden eagle eating a serpent sitting on top of a prickly pear cactus. And the prickly pear cactus and the symbol beneath it are actually the Aztec glyphs for the city of Tenochtitlan, the capital that they would found upon this island. Tenochtitlan literally translates to place of the prickly pear cactus. The Mexica expanded the island by reclaiming Lake Texcoco for agriculture, using what are called chinampas, or floating gardens. Large baskets, as much as 10 feet wide and 20 feet long, were woven and then staked into the bed of the shallow lake. Soil was taken from the bed of the lake and used to fill these baskets, and then crops would be planted in them. They would also plant trees along the edge, and the roots of the trees would grow down to further anchor these to the lake bed. And through this method, slowly and gradually, acreage was added to the island that Tenochtitlan was built upon. And it created very rich agricultural fields, because the organic rich soils reclaimed from the lake's bed provided a very fertile soil for the growth of crops. And also the water from the lake percolated and infiltrated into the sediments below the gardens, and the roots from the crops could grow down into the water, having a steady supply and assuring an agricultural bounty. In the southern end of the Valley of Mexico, some of these chinampas are still preserved in an area known as Xochimilco, the flower garden. And if you visit Mexico City, you can go to Xochimilco and ride around in these canals between these ancient raised beds that have been created to reclaim the lake for agriculture. Tenochtitlan grew, and eventually, by 1519, when the Spanish arrived, it had a population of around 250,000. Now, the Spanish who arrived in 1519 were not a bunch of Spanish peasants, rubes from the countryside who had not seen the world. They were cosmopolitan and well-traveled mercenaries who had traveled all throughout the Mediterranean basin, had been to all the large cities of that region, Rome, Venice, Byzantium, and they were awestruck when they saw Tenochtitlan, how large it was, how orderly it was in its arrangement, with roads and canals allowing access throughout the city. By this time, the island was connected to the mainland by a series of causeways. You can see one of these in the very lower portion of the image. It is a raised road that allows foot travel into the city from the shore of the lake. After fleeing Culhuacan and establishing Tenochtitlan, the Mexica came to be the subjects of the Texcoco king of Azcapotzalco. In 1428, there was a successional war between brothers for the throne of this city, and this led to the assassination of the Mexica king at the time. He was seen as a rival to one of the brothers and an ally to the other. The new king of the Mexica then created an alliance with two other vassal cities of Azcapotzalco, Tlacopan and Texcoco, and this triple alliance overthrew the king of Azcapotzalco and established the foundations of the Aztec Empire. And they referred to this as the Triple Alliance, although from the beginning the Mexica were the most important members, and as time went on came to dominate the Triple Alliance. The empire expanded through conquest, and this conquest provided the empire control of different environmental zones and the resources that could be produced there. The Valley of Mexico is at a very high elevation. Most of it is above 7,000 feet, and the upper limit of corn agriculture is 8,200 feet. The upper limit of cotton agriculture is 5,600 feet, so no cotton could be grown in the Valley of Mexico. Neither could agave, nor were there any rubber trees or cacao trees, so many of these resources had to be obtained from other areas that could produce them. Rather than obtaining them through trade at an often high price, the Aztecs sought to conquer these areas, to subjugate these adjacent territories, and to force them to pay tribute in the resources that the Aztecs desired. The empire was expanded by campaigns of conquest by successive emperors, and when each emperor was first installed, one of the first tasks that they had to accomplish was to go on a victorious campaign against their enemies to demonstrate their power. Tenochtitlan and the neighboring city of Tlatelolco were the commercial center of the empire. Tlatelolco had the largest market in the entire empire, and traders and merchants from all throughout the empire brought their wares in order to exchange them at this market. Specialized production requires a market economy in order to exchange resources produced by specialists for other goods and services provided by other specialists. And there are distinctions when looking at the markets in the Aztec Empire between local markets and long-distance trade. All communities had local markets to allow subsistence goods and craft goods to be marketed by local community members, and also to allow them access to outside goods that are imported. Now, most goods and products were produced and marketed locally. They are often exchanged via barter. I'm going to trade the resources that I produce that you need for resources that you produce that I need. I have corn, you have cotton. We will exchange these. However, when you can't come to an agreement to exchange one resource for another, there were mediums of exchange, crude forms of money, primarily cacao beans, beads or pendants made from jade, shell, or turquoise. For highly valued items, copper axes or bells, and in some cases, gold. Metal was very rare in the Aztec Empire. Metal was much more common in the Western Tarascan Empire, particularly copper and forms of bronze, and gold was more common to the south, in Oaxaca and down into Costa Rica. And this rarity made metal a very desired resource. Long-distance trade brought resources from adjacent areas to these local markets, and whereas local markets were primarily run by local vendors, long-distance trade was controlled by an ancient trading guild called the Pochteca. It's believed that the Pochteca as an institution may date back to the beginnings of Mesoamerican complex societies, that they may have first been established among the Olmec and continued to maintain themselves as a distinct political and economic entity until the Aztec period. The Pochteca maintained trading outposts in distant lands in order to obtain exotic raw materials from these distant regions, and they would obtain them by exchanging them with local elites who had control of the access to these resources, and they would provide finely crafted items that associated these local elites with the power of the Aztec Empire. Now, during the Aztec Empire, the Pochteca were financed by noble patrons who desired the resources that were brought back. And the Pochteca also exerted some level of control over local markets, where they were the ultimate source of authority in adjudicating disputes between various parties in economic transactions. In addition to using the Pochteca to obtain exotic raw materials that were used by the Aztec elite to express their power and wealth, the Pochteca were also used by the Aztec Empire as a means of collecting information about their neighbors in order to better understand them and prepare for wars of conquest. Warfare was the primary means that the Aztec used to extend their political and economic control over adjacent territories. And in this artist's reconstruction, we see an Aztec army on the move, after defeating a city, moving on to conquer other territories. Aztec armies consisted of some professional full-time soldiers, but many of the grunts, so to speak, were conscripted commoners. The professional class of soldiers was drawn from the elite strata of society, members of noble families that joined warrior societies associated with the state religion in order to demonstrate their loyalty and fealty to the emperor. Warfare also provided opportunities for certain nobles to increase their status, particularly if you were a second or third-born son who would not inherit the title of their father. These professional nobles would then conscript peasants and commoners from their domain in order to serve them as footmen in battle. And here we see a column of soldiers marching after defeating the enemy. We can see the temple and the city burning behind them. In the very front, you can see a nobleman carrying his club over his shoulder and wearing a fancily embroidered tunic, and behind him commoners in simple breechclouts carrying his shield and weapons and the goods that they will need to support themselves during the campaign. These noblemen were organized in warrior societies that were associated with the state religion, and there were rankings of these warriors, from relatively low-ranking officers to high-ranking generals. And here in the foreground we see a general dressed in a specific costume identifying him as associated with Mictlantecuhtli, the god of death. And he is being reported to by a member of a special group of warriors. There were 3 different primary warrior societies that were associated with the state religion: the eagles, the jaguars, and the coyotes. Here we see a member of the Coyote Society, who were scouts that moved ahead in order to scout the lands that the army would move through. And he is reporting to the general about what they have found. All male youth were trained in the military arts and were expected to participate, if conscripted, in the wars of the empire. Nobles, however, had a greater expectation, and they also had a greater chance of receiving rewards through this system. There were various costumes and regalia that were awarded to warriors for achieving particular war honors, and this created a system of ranking, of officers that have different power and authority, as well as different privileges. Here we see a Queshtecatli, which is the rank a warrior achieved after having captured 2 enemies in battle. He had a distinctive costume that he wore in battle, distinctive design on the shield and the costume. And it wasn't just the costume that he wore into battle. The same design could be embroidered on a cloak that he would wear in everyday life that would signal to everyone his military rank. There are also particular ornaments that were allowed to be worn. that would also signal the rank of the individual. From texts that were collected by the Spanish after the conquest, we know a lot about this system of ranking. The Spanish were very interested in the military organization of the Aztec, so they could understand their enemy and understand how to convert the enemy into allies. This page from the Codex Mendoza details the ranking of warriors from essentially a private all the way up to a general. As you achieved different war honors, you would be rewarded and increased in rank, provided new costumes, new power and authority, greater privileges. So on the left in the middle row, we see a Quetzalcoatl, someone who has captured 2 individuals in battle. Then we see additional ranks going up until at the lower right we have a general. But to the left of the general, the individual in the yellow costume with the shield with the yellow and green, this is a special class of warrior. These were individuals who had achieved so many war honors they could be generals, but declined that so they could remain on the front lines. In our modern military, when new ranks are granted or awards given, medals given out for achievements, they are often given by the commanding officer of the individual who is receiving the award or the advancement in ranks unit, their colonel, their general. But in the Aztec Empire, all of these awards were bestowed personally by the emperor, creating a patron-client relationship between the emperor and his warriors. So here we see the emperor rewarding warriors with new accoutrements that would indicate their status and their rank. New earrings and nose ornaments and hair ornaments at the top, and at the bottom specially designed textiles that indicated their role and rank. The military provided opportunities for social advancement for both elites and commoners. If you were a member of a minor noble lineage, you had the potential of increasing your status. Officers could also often be rewarded not just with increase in rank and new social privileges that may have come from that, they could also be granted control of some of the territories that they assisted in the conquest of, being established as a noble class in these new territories, given the control of land, the people upon that land, the labor of that people, and all the resources that could be extracted from it. This was used as a tool by the emperor in order to manage and control elite factions, in order to co-opt their aspirations for power and direct them towards the goal of the state. Rather than challenging the existing order, they become intimately associated with the existing order, and they want to further the goals of the existing order in order to advance themselves. And there were 3 primary warrior sodalities that were institutionalized within the Aztec Empire: the eagles, the jaguars, and the coyotes. The eagles and the jaguars each had their own temple that was directly associated with the Templo Mayor, the primary pyramid at the heart of Tenochtitlan. It was almost like a frat house for these warriors, a place where they could go and socialize with their peers. It was where they went to perform certain rituals to empower themselves before heading into battle, and it provided themselves a direct association with the emperor and imperial power. Aztec warfare was a little bit different than modern warfare, but in some ways it was very similar. In modern warfare, one of the goals of conflict is to destroy the command and control structures of the enemy, to limit their ability to effectively organize and resist your incursion. When the Aztec attacked, one of their enemies, one of their primary strategic goals was to desecrate their sacred pyramids and temples, to cut off their access to the supernatural, to prevent their rulers from being able to turn the powers of the supernatural world against the Aztec. So in some ways, this is an attack upon the institutions of command and control of their enemies. And in this image from the Codex Mendoza, we see an Aztec warrior setting light to the temple of the Huexotzingo, while their warriors look on in horror, perhaps losing their morale as they see their temple destroyed. But it wasn't just that they would destroy the temples of the enemy, they would also capture images of the enemy gods, statues, and other representations of the deities of the enemy would be captured and then imprisoned in a special temple at the Templo Mayor complex. They are cutting off the connection that their enemies have to their deities and limiting their ability to channel the supernatural powers towards their armies and against the Aztec. The Aztec developed a specialized weapon that was used in warfare called the macuahuitl. It is a club made from hardwood, almost like a fraternity paddle, and along the edge, in a slot that was engraved into it, blades of razor-sharp obsidian would be set. Now, in combat, as you struck the enemy with your macuahuitl, the obsidian would, in many cases, break, which would create new, sharper edges. But at some point, they would need to be replaced. So they could be removed from the slot, and a new blade could be glued in. The author of the article you had to read about Aztec imperial strategies, Ross Hassig, has written a whole book on Aztec warfare, if you are interested. Hassig suggests that the Aztec followed two different strategies to expand and maintain their empire. They had a territorial strategy and a hegemonic strategy. In a territorial empire, areas that are conquered have their local leaders replaced with those who are loyal to the empire, and these new foreign leaders would be supported by a military garrison that would be stationed there. This is very expensive. Tribute and taxation on the subjugated population would be heavy in order to support these administrative costs. So there were greater demands on state administration, as well as greater demands on the local populations, which could lead to resentments. An alternate to this is what's called the hegemonic imperial strategy, where local leaders were co-opted and controlled through threat of military action. You may defeat them in a small battle and then convince them to surrender and become part of the Aztec Empire. If you're cooperative and surrender quickly, we will leave you in your position of power, allow you to administer things for us that you have to pass on tribute and taxes to the empire, but it allows local leaders the option of maintaining their position. The costs in tribute and the cost to administer these hegemonic expansion was much lower, but also lowered the opportunity cost for local leaders to rebel. At certain points, they might decide they didn't want to pay the tribute. They might note that the Aztec army was overextended and engaged with another enemy on the opposite side of the empire, allowing them an opportunity to reject Aztec rule and reassert their independence. The Aztec preferred following the hegemonic approach because of its lower cost, but they would apply the territorial approach when needed. If the hegemonic approach did not result in expected levels of tribute flow, or led to disputes with local leaders who might be resistant, then new military campaigns would be sent in order to remove those local leaders and install Aztec administrators. And in some cases, Aztec colonists would be moved into these areas in order to dilute the local population and prevent resistance. When we get to the Inca, we'll see how this territorial approach was taken to a greater degree in order to exert control over conquered subjects. Another strategy that was adopted by the Aztec was what is called the Flowery War, Xochitl. These were arranged battles that limited the number of combatants engaged and also limited the number of casualties that were taken. And while there were limits on violence, it still allowed the accumulation of war honors by participants and the capture of sacrificial victims. So while the good things of war were allowed while limiting the amount of damage that could occur. Now these would be much less expensive than your standard war of conquest. You have a smaller army to support in the field. They are of a very set length of time that would limit the amount of resources needed to support your army while it is in the field. So it lessens the amount of logistical support that was needed. And it's believed that this was a strategy that was used in order to limit the expenses in both lives and in materials expended in warfare. However, it still facilitated the state's needs to have warfare, the awarding of war honors in order to develop a patron-client relationship between the emperor and the elite and commoner classes, and also providing sacrificial victims to be used in the state religion and demonstrate the might and power of the Aztec Empire on the home front. One of the goals of human sacrifice was not just to demonstrate the power of the state and what happens to those who resist the state, but it was almost like a version of CNN for the locals living in Tenochtitlan to see and visually appreciate the conquests of their army. How do I know that they have been down in Huero, conquering that area and incorporating it into the empire? Well, because the rulers of these city-states in Huero that have been conquered are brought back to the capital and sacrificed in public ceremonies to validate this conquest. Others suggest that flowery wars were actually a strategy used by the Aztec to wear down certain difficult opponents while limiting their loss of life and expensive material. They could slowly and cheaply chip away at the strength of their opponents, wearing them down through these limited engagements until they were weak enough to be conquered. After a territory was subjugated and incorporated into the Aztec Empire, they were expected to pay tribute on an annual basis to the emperor. This is like a form of tax. However, it was not just a percentage of their earnings, but rather there was a set amount of certain resources that were required to be provided. And here from the Codex Mendoza, we have a page that describes the tribute demands on Coatzacoalcos, a city-state in Oaxaca that was conquered by the Aztec. The column on the left-hand side has the glyphs of the place names of all the cities within this domain. At the top is the glyph for Coatzacoalcos, the Plain of Snakes, and below it glyphs for subordinate communities within its realm that now were also incorporated into the Aztec system. So Coatzacoalcos and all of its subjugated territories were required to pay to the Aztec Empire on an annual basis all of the materials shown on this page. Across the top, we see 5 different types of woven textiles with very specific designs. And there is a glyph on the top, sometimes called the hair or feather glyph, that indicates 400 of each were required. 2 feathered military uniforms were also required, and these were incredibly labor-intensive to produce. They have a cotton garment that then has tens, if not hundreds of thousands of feathers sewn onto it. And this is almost like rubbing salt in the wounds. Our soldiers wearing these types of uniforms conquered your territory. Now we require you to produce those uniforms for us. There are also bundles of quetzal feathers, 2 bundles indicating 800 quetzal feathers. Now, Coatzacoalcos in Oaxaca is not where quetzals live, but the Aztec didn't care. You still need to provide these and obtain them somehow. Also, gold dust, jade beads, feather and turquoise mosaic emblems. And down in the lower left, those bags with red spot are bags of cochineal insects, a small insect that's found on prickly pear cactuses that was used to create a red dye. So all of these materials had to be collected, aggregated, and then given to the empire on an annual basis in order to ensure their compliance and ensure peace. In some areas, the tribute demands were for locally produced resources that the Aztec could not produce themselves in their homeland. So the Aztlan province in modern Veracruz, which is at a low elevation and ideally suited for the cultivation of cotton, they had to provide lots of cotton. Both containers of raw cotton that would be transported to the Aztec capital and available for craftsmen there to transform it into textiles, but also specific types of textiles with different patterns woven into them. The Huastec region, where the Aztlan province is located, was an important source of cotton that was conquered by Moctezuma I in the 1450s. This area, however, chafed under the rule of the Aztec and constantly tried to throw off the Aztec yoke that subordinated them. And while a hegemonic imperial strategy was initially employed, the resistance to tribute demands led to local rulers being replaced by Aztec administrators. In some areas, colonists from the Basin of Mexico were sent with these new administrators in order to dilute the local population and provide a population that was known to be more loyal to the emperor. Also, symbols of state power were built, like here a pyramid at the Castillo de Tejo, which is in some ways a miniature version of the Templo Mayor, the primary pyramid of the Aztec Empire at Tenochtitlan. So what to remember? Through alliance and warfare, the Mexica rose from barbarian mercenary immigrants to become the ruling power in the Valley of Mexico. The Mexica reclaimed large areas of Lake Texcoco using chinampas, floating gardens, in order to expand the size of the island in the middle of Lake Texcoco where they settled. The Valley of Mexico's high elevation prevented the production of certain desired resources, like cotton, rubber, and cacao, and rather than obtaining them at great cost through trade, the Aztec Empire expanded through conquest and intimidation to control lands that provided access to these desired resources. The Aztec limited the expense of imperial expansion through primarily using a hegemonic imperial strategy of intimidating and then co-opting local rulers into the empire. They used flowery wars, arranged battles that limited expenses and casualties while still providing the benefits of captives for sacrifice and the creation of patron-client relations between the emperor and his subjects. They also slowly wore down the enemy's power, making them more vulnerable to conquest. One of the limits of this hegemonic strategy was that there was little to no investment in transportation infrastructure that would connect the capital to the frontiers of the empire and allow the rapid movement of not just goods, but also information and, if need be, soldiers. If the hegemonic approach, however, failed to realize the desired tribute flows, if there was continued resistance, a territorial strategy would be imposed. The local leaders would be deposed, Aztec nobility installed as the new leaders, and this new Aztec ruler would then be supported by a permanent resident military garrison. Now this is expensive, and hence greater preference was held for the hegemonic approach. Another strategy that was sometimes used as part of the territorial approach was to import colonists from the homeland, colonists who were loyal to the empire, settling them in these conquered territories in order to dilute the local population of conquered subjects. And we will see this strategy was developed to a much greater degree by the Inca, leading in some ways to a much more efficiently operated empire that was able to expand to a much greater size than the Aztec.